Andy Letcher, who is joining us for the second episode. Thanks for joining us, Andy.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. We've known each other for quite a while now, I guess. I think you were one of, if not the first, maybe the second speaker for the Kent Psychedelic Society.
Gosh, right, that's a few years ago.
Yeah, so it would have been just after you published Shroom.
Yeah, would that have been 2007, 2008, something like that?
Yeah, it probably wouldn't have been till 2010 actually, that
Oh,
because we
okay.
started the society in 2009.
Okay.
But I remember your book being one of the first, books that I'd come across in the psychedelic space, and I was thinking about this recently, that my first foray into psychedelic literature was possibly from this critical analysis point of view, and so for me at a relatively young age of about 19, 20, I guess I was proceeding a little bit with caution, and I really appreciated this view to not just go head first into everything, but actually understand why it is that we think that the things we do about psychedelics, and really picking stuff apart. So
Nice.
yeah,
Well, thank you. I forget what degree were you doing? Were you already sort of doing some kind of critical thinking? Were you in the humanities?
yeah. So I did politics undergrad and
Okay.
postgrad. So I did modules in critical thought. So for me, I guess there was that natural propensity to, and I was doing modules in the philosophy department looking at epistemology and ontology.
Yeah. So I think once you've got a kind of taste for that, then that is your approach to life. I mean, the book, in case you don't know, people listening don't know, it's Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom. It's quite old now. It came out in 2006. But at that point, I mean, it predates what people are calling the psychedelic renaissance. And at that point, psychedelics were still very underground. And so it was very much bound up with having a countercultural identity, and psychedelia was critical of the man, of the mainstream. And so to turn the critique back on psychedelia was, I suppose, a foolhardy thing to do. But I um, it bothered me that pretty much every book I was picking up on psychedelics would retell the story of how psychedelics were discovered, and it had become a sort of mantra, like a myth that people were just telling over and over again. It was of no relevance to the rest of the content of the book, but every book felt duty bound to sort of rehash this story. And I thought, well, what happens if you go back to the original sources, and how much of this stuff actually holds weight? And often very little of it does, or there's other interpretations of the evidence, or there's nuance, or and I felt like actually it was a very pro psychedelic move. It was showing that, look, we can partake in critical thinking and apply that to ourselves, and still see the value of psychedelics. It doesn't need to rely on wishful thinking. So that was my kind of motivation, and I suppose it's still my motivation. Really, is let's think about this. I always hold in mind a quote from Terence McKenna on one of his millions of talks that you can find online, and he said, I'll probably paraphrase, I think we should say a word about the method, which is rationality applied at the weird edges. That's what's always worked for me. And I think that's my methodology, is rationality applied at the weird edges. Doesn't mean I want to get rid of the weird edges, far from it. I love the weird edges, but I do want to think about them carefully, and not necessarily take everything at face value.
I think that's a really interesting point, particularly with where we're at the moment. Do you see something of a, I guess, either or situation where it's either being overly medicalized or it's too wishy-washy and spiritual, and the lines are getting a bit blurred. No one really knows where to place these things.
I mean, so I think sorry, too many thoughts in my head. Let me try and gather them. So I began life as a scientist before moving across to the humanities. And I think the humanities tends to be quite critical of science. And, you know, I've done history and philosophy of science, and dipped a toe into science technology studies. And it's very easy to sort of pick it apart and find fault with it. And since November, I've started working at the University of Exeter, delivering their PGCert in psychedelics. I'm in a psychology department. I'm surrounded by scientists, and I've been really struck by how humble and reflective and reflexive scientists are, even in their papers. And we tend to forget that, you know, we get the results that are reported, not all the lists of caveats that scientists put at the end. So I'm pleasantly surprised by that reflexive turn that is happening in psychedelic science. It's not always reported. But at the same time, having said all that, we are now moving towards a world in which a psychological discourse prevails, in which the legitimate way to take psychedelics is in the clinic, in the hands of professionals, going on an individual journey, listening to a playlist with an eye shade on for therapeutic purposes. And I'm not knocking that, because I think that's got huge value to people. It's just that wasn't my gateway to psychedelics. My gateway to psychedelics was sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yes.
And you know, I'm Gen X, and I came of age with the dreadful feeling that I just missed the party of the century a decade earlier, or 15 years earlier. And you know, wanted to sort of capture some of that spirit of the 60s, which I suppose I was lucky enough to do, being around for the emergence of rave. And so, although my position has softened very much on what's happening at the moment, my concern is still that as the psychological discourse becomes the dominant way of thinking about psychedelics, the recreational, the artistic, the hedonistic, the spiritual pursuit, the Gnostic pursuit, is marginalized and remains as marginalized as it ever was. And so I would always want to defend a multitude of contexts for taking psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, I often speak to people about the Kent Psychedelic Society in somewhat of a, I don't know if it's paradoxical, but you know, there was myself, Jacob Brandt, and obviously Dave King that started the society, and I think myself and Jacob came from more of the artistic perspective, and Dave came from more of the scientific perspective. Although Dave is incredibly artistic, you know, he made a book that he illustrated all about psychedelics, and you know, it's probably the first bit of psychedelic literature I read was just from this student at my uni. And you know, some of the first literature was, you know, the big one being The Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner, because I was playing in a band called, named after the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Right, yeah, yeah.
I
So
just happen to have a copy in my bag. I
Amazing.
honestly don't carry it around with me like a Bible.
Wow.
It's coincidence.
So I was playing in a band called Bardo Thadal, named after the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And, you know, Jacob said, oh, have a read of this, you know, psychedelic experience. And it was this psychedelic spirituality. It was a way of framing the psychedelic experience in line with some, I guess, religious traditions, but in a way that it set out a bit of a framework. And I understood it within this context of reincarnation. And then, you know, looking at people like McKenna, where it was a psychedelic based philosophy, spirituality. And, you know, playing music, listening to psychedelic bands, doing lots of, really explicitly getting deep in, acid in particular with music. But in order to legitimize the society, it was very heavy on, lots of broad range of academic disciplines, but quite heavy on the science. It was very much, well, if we can have a doctor presenting empirical graphs and data, and we really did, I guess, champion that, celebrate it. And in the background, we knew where it might lead, but I guess we weren't necessarily aware that it would lead to where it's at, where the overwhelming dominant narrative is about psychotherapy and healing trauma. It's become very bottlenecked, it feels like.
And I think, I mean, I hear you. And there are other university psychedelic societies that name themselves the University of wherever it is, Psychedelic Research Society, as if, they really need to insert that word to make, we're not, we're researching psychedelics as a phenomena that happens over there. And I understand the political expediency of these moves. The hope, I mean, the movers and shakers or a lot of the movers and shakers in the psychedelic renaissance have put forward the case that if we can use science to legitimize psychedelics in a therapeutic context, that will by necessity have a kind of spin-off effect whereby psychedelics per se get legitimized. I'm not wholly persuaded by that argument, but I can see that the science has driven, the changes that we've witnessed in the last 20 years. I mean, again, I think there was a hope amongst the psychedelic enthusiasts when I wrote my book that if you could demonstrate that there was a long unbroken tradition of psychedelic usage in Europe, that would be enough to provide a kind of legitimacy. I think that's what gave a kind of effectual impetus to that argument. That's why people were so upset when I came along and questioned that historical narrative. Not everyone, but a number of people were. But of course, nobody is ever persuaded by history or historical arguments. Science is the driver of thought in contemporary Western culture, and it is science that has driven the psychedelic renaissance. But again, I come back to this, and I know this is a view we've shared in conversations in conference corridors, that there is this very exciting psychedelic subculture, counterculture that's existed since Huxley's Laws of Perception, so 70 years of it, and it's produced great music, great art, and festivals, and it's impacted culture in so many ways. And the danger is that we forget that, or we regard it as a historical curiosity, or we lampoon it as the worst excesses of hippiedom. But I think it was and remains a very important movement, and has a lot, there's a hunger, isn't there, amongst psychedelic enthusiasts to find what is the correct context, what is the correct way to take these substances. And all eyes now are on the Amazon or on the Americas, and looking towards the indigenous as well. They've got historical traditions, and maybe we should learn from them. Absolutely, maybe we should. But also, we've got 70 years of mistakes and triumphs and acid tests and DIY mushroom ceremonies. They're often not documented or not written about, but they're there. So maybe we should make the most of what our own culture has given us.
Yeah, I think it's particularly with, I guess you need to say kind of re-enchantment of this place, but the enchantment of the British Isles, you know, all of this magic that we have here, and not to kind of, I don't know, speak in weird like ethno-nationalist terms, because you've got to maybe be a bit careful of that. But there is something where it's like, you know, I encounter it a lot in Brighton with the New Age subculture, where there's a lot which is outsourced to different cultures, and then that is marketable because it's different, it's less hidden, right? You know, a lot of the pagan stuff, the psychedelic rich history of the UK, it's kind of been literally concreted over. It's sometimes easier just to kind of, I don't know, maybe book a flight and go to Peru and drink ayahuasca than to like find areas in the UK which are of cultural, spiritual significance. You know, they might not be necessarily that accessible, and you know, they might be on a parcel of land that's then got loads of other landowners around it, and all this kind of weird stuff about our society here that tends to separate us from the land and this sense of indigeneity. And I struggle to kind of see how we can reclaim that. But I mean, I do look to you know, your generation, Generation X, you know, the ravers, because I think there's a lot there which, you know, probably produced really transformative healing experiences within more of a community, cultural, societal arena, where it's not, okay, we're explicitly having a ceremony, but there are ceremonial type spaces, ritualized spaces within the wider entertainment enjoyment space, you know.
Yes, and I think, you know, we should regard rave as a ritual, and one that's been so successful that it's still with us, right? I mean, youth movements, they last a certain amount of time, and then they're swept away. So the hippie movement was swept away by punk, and punk just sort of gradually fell apart in its own bile. And, well, people, you know, people, they get old and they start having children, so they, you know,
Yeah.
they can't be countercultural all their lives. But rave carries on, and the form of the music really hasn't changed. It's got more sophisticated in terms of production values, but the form hasn't remarkably changed, and nor has the form of the the ritual element of it. So I'm thinking back to the days of, I used to go to Megatripolis, this club in London, organized by the people who put together the Encyclopedia Psychedelica International magazine during the late 80s and 90s. And what did they have? They had an opening ceremony. They had DJ spaces. They had chill out spaces. They had healing spaces. Earlier in the evening, they had talks. It's like a festival in a box. And most raves have something like that. It works. So there is a ritual technology that arose very, very quickly as this is the right vehicle for taking MDMA and LSD. And there it is. That didn't happen in the Amazon. It happened in the warehouses around the M25.
Yeah. I mean, you know, having been to things like Whirligig and just being surprised at having such just beautiful, amazing, connected experiences. You know, I grew up in London, and then kind of, you know, leaving London and then going back there as an adult and having these really lovely experiences, just kind of coming out of a club and then being on, you know, Euston Road and just having a different perception of community. You know, doesn't have to be this explicitly sacred space. It can be made sacred even in the heart of Babylon.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose that's one of the things that really interests me as a scholar, is what are the contexts that people are creating for taking psychedelics? I think there is a sort of feeling amongst what I call loosely the medicine community of people who travel repeatedly to drink ayahuasca or go to Mexico to take peyote or whatever it is, Gabon to do iboga. There's a sense that they are hungry for something homegrown, and like, what's our context? What's our medicine? And I know people are starting to sort of create and curate, say, mushroom ceremonies. And so I'm sort of always intrigued to track those, and I think people are starting to wonder, well, what do we have here? And of course we do have loads. It may not have a venerable and unbroken history going all the way back to pre-Christian days, but a lot of it is old, 100, 200 years old. That's old. That's a tradition. I'm thinking about traditional folk customs.
Yeah.
So if you look at something like Morris dancing, which, 10, 15 years ago, it's what Chris Wood, the folk musician, would say people crossed the street to avoid. But now we've got, a total growth in the number of overtly pagan Morris sides. We've got sides like Boss Morris in Stroud who are completely reinventing Morris dancing and making extraordinary costumes and films and rituals. And so I think British folklore, folk custom, the plethora of sacred sites that you've been talking about, stone circles, tours, holy wells, and what have you, it's all there. It's all there, and it's for everyone. It really is. There's this saying, isn't there? Folklore is for everyone. Well, it is, and we just have to make it our own. So what happens when psychedelia meets the pagan revival that's been going on since the Second World War? Then I think we're into really exciting territory.
Do you see it as a counter to or complementary with, and I suppose this is maybe one of the grand questions, is looking at where everything is going with psychedelic therapy and the focus on trauma, the focus on healing trauma, and I guess how that exists alongside the more celebrative side. I mean, I know, we kind of originally came together to have this chat based on the talk you gave at Breaking Convention this year on the idea of Ludere, of play. And I wonder how that fits, because I don't know, I was speaking to someone the other day who said, oh, well, the conversations around play and psychedelics have, people have been having those conversations quite a lot, which to me, I didn't really think that was the case, but maybe I'd been out of the loop a bit. But I wonder how these conversations around kind of joy, ritual, celebration, play, how they coexist with this dominant narrative.
Yeah. So in the talk at Breaking Convention, it was actually about a celebration of Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception.
Oh, that's right.
And I was just noticing when I reread the essay that there were several times when Huxley is just overcome with laughter, and that it's not an element that I've seen picked up before. People are normally focusing on his mystical kind of experiences or his mystico-mimetic experiences. And yet, there's times in the essay where he's unable to move. He's laughing so much. The tears are rolling down his face when he looks at an American car, which he just finds so egotistical and preposterous, these 1950s American cars.
Yeah.
And my suggestion is that this ludic quality is actually an inherent part of the psychedelic experience, and that we ignore it at our peril. One can think of countless examples from psychedelic history. The merry pranksters. There's a lovely Hawkwind anecdote So Hawkwind were at Stonehenge at the Free Festival, when there used to be a free festival at Stonehenge every summer solstice, lasting a month. And the high point of it was, or the ceremonial focus was, when the sun rose on the summer solstice. And of course, the Druids came and celebrated, and they'd parade in their elaborate costumes and do this, frankly, rather dull celebration. But the actor Ken Barlow, who was in Coronation Street, was a Druid, and Hawkwind spot Ken Barlow coming in, who they all recognise off the telly. They're obviously tripping their heads off, and they start this chant going, Ken Barlow, Ken Barlow, Ken Barlow. And to me, that's sort of priceless, because there's a sort of real psychedelic humor in that. This real, we're just going to rip the piss mercilessly. And yet at the same time, somewhere underneath it is this feeling that the summer solstice sunrise needs to be met with some kind of chant, with some kind of, and so it's playful, ludic, and yet absolutely they nail it. They completely nail it. We should all be chanting Ken Barlow as the summer solstice sun comes out, not taking ourselves at all seriously, but meaning it, you know.
It's that interesting thing I find, you know, when I've been tripping with friends, and I even, you know, I remember a difficult experience, not for myself, but for someone who was part of a group who didn't really know us very well. So there was kind of 4 of us that knew each other quite well, and this one person who was a bit new to the group. And we'd been tripping, and we'd kind of ended the night by watching some Attenborough. And what came on was this mating ritual of the great crested grebes. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's quite ridiculous. And they sort of like go up into the water, and they sort of look like they're skating along the water. And it's really elaborate, and it's funny. And we started laughing, and this person got really angry. They're like, "What are you doing? This is beautiful. This is nature." And we were like, "Yeah, we know it is. It is beautiful, but it's also really funny." And there was a real difficulty with this person, and it turned into a bit of a kind of strange paranoid episode for this person, unfortunately. But I've had so many times with people that I know really well, and we can be getting really in depth to something quite serious, and then also be able to rip the piss, particularly out of spirituality. You know, I had a friend at uni who was a Hindu, and he was really well versed in, you know, in the scriptures, in Vedic scriptures, and then when we tripped together, we would just take the piss out of it. You know, and it would be really fun, and we'd have it was kind of serious in a way. We really understood that this was important, that being able to make fun doesn't diminish it, actually allows you to appreciate it in a way which is kind of psychedelic.
And I mean, I hear you, and I think there's different ways of laughing. You can laugh at something, and there's the kind of satire that is designed to sort of pull someone down from an elevated position, you know, the kind of satire that's directed at politicians, and that seems very fair to me. But you can also laugh with someone, and it's kind of generative, and I think that's what there's a playful quality to it. I think that's what you're kind of getting at. Well, you know, I'm thinking of a band like Gong, who came up with this whole, or David Allen came up with this whole insane, ridiculous, not to be taken seriously cosmology of hothead pixies in their flying teapots, and yet it was deadly serious. As the most, absolutely, we're talking about the deepest spiritual truths here, but we're going to laugh at them because there's a feeling of the joke of existence.
Yeah, that's an interesting, you know, the prog scene was very psychedelic and very playful, very mystical, magical. The music was sounds very playful, it's, and I guess some of that culture seems to be a bit lost, or it's just seen as, and I suppose people of that generation aren't necessarily around, you know, much, there's not many of them around, and where that's kind of placed is a bit difficult to see, and where art and music are, I'm aware as a musician where I'm seeing, whether it's playlists for psychedelic experiences or it's medicine, devotional music, it's very kind of clearly intended to heal. And a lot of the visual art as well, it's very explicit in its message, in what it's trying to convey. And there's not so much play, I find, with the creative arts and psychedelia. Everyone's quite serious.
I made this point in my talk at Breaking Convention that psychedelics have become a serious business, and it is a serious business trying to heal someone of depression. I mean, that is right. And it's become a serious business in that there's a lot of people hoping to make a lot of money out of psychedelics along the way. But if my contention is right, that they are inherently playful, and playful doesn't necessarily mean funny, but if they do encourage us to play, then at some point that will become laughter. And my concern is that the seriousness of the apparatus with which we are holding, as a technology of the self, that seriousness with which we're holding it is not well equipped to receive the ludic moments.
Do you think there's elements surrounding safety? Because I often think in something like a relationship, whether it's an intimate partner or it's a friendship, in order to have that play, there needs to be an element of safety, in the sense that if you're going to be silly, you want someone to be silly with you, and you don't want that person to look at you and judge you and think, why are you being silly? And so I guess, do you think there's something where if we're worried that psychedelics aren't that safe and we need to have these safety protocols and it's about healing and trauma, then okay, there's elements of joy within those healing experiences. There's elements of resonance and coming to a place of maybe feeling happiness where you hadn't had that happiness before, which is all really important stuff on the healing journey. But again, that's not the same as play, is it?
No, it isn't. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of uppermost in my thoughts at the moment, because I'm speaking at a conference on integration next week, and I think psychedelics are inherently risky, and that's not a popular view at the moment. There is always an element of risk. There has to be. There's a risk that you won't be the same. That's risky, even if the not being the same is someone who is going from being ill to being well. That is risky in that, you're not the same person. There's a risk if you have an ego dissolution moment. Will you come back? It is inherently risky, and so all these safeguards are being put in place to try and mitigate that risk. But I think one of the risks that's being ignored is, I can't think of a better way to put it than the weirdness. Like, psychedelics hurl you into the weird, but there are moments of complete strangeness. I remember sitting around a fire on my 30th birthday. We were all just coming up on mushrooms, and some guy was there who I didn't really know very well. And he just suddenly screamed out, "Mushrooms make you weird!" And it sort of had this sort of portentous quality to it. as these kind of statements do. I mean, he was bang on the money, right? They make you weird, and yet we're expecting people to not be weird when they come back. We're expecting them to be well. We're expecting them to come back without the weirdness, and so there's a difference now that people are wanting to take psychedelics to get well, to get healed, whereas before the psychedelic renaissance, I think people took psychedelics for the weird. So now people are talking about ontological shock. How can you get informed consent from a patient for something that you cannot prepare someone for the ontological shock of a psychedelic experience? You can't. You have to do it, right? And yet, in previous generations, people have gone, that's exactly why I want to take psychedelics, is for the ontological weirdness. I want that validation that the world is not as dull and boring as I've been led to believe. And then there was a ready-made counterculture for them to join. So there's these like minds, this community of people. And I think it's that community element that is the most important. So when people are talking about integration, I think really what they mean is trying to find like-minded souls that they can go, you know what, I met these Egyptian deities and they said they were going to kill me, and then it all went fucking weird, and then I was, etc. Whatever it is, you try and do that in the office on Monday morning, and you're going to be met with a bemused look, right?
I mean, it's interesting, I often think in this sense, I have the benefit of having been a bit weird at school, been on the fringes. I was bullied. I kind of naturally gravitated towards people who were outliers. So for me, it was a real, I found my tribe. It was a real just total release to be able to find people that I could be myself, be weird with, and not feel judged for it, and not only that, but feel celebrated for it, to have a lot of joy and play. I always think of acid as like joke fuel. If you're with people that you know well and that you're on a kind of similar vibe with, and you take some acid, it's like there's so much funny wordplay and just play around concepts, and this kind of collaborative experience to flesh out the weirdness and find where these interesting patterns are, and it becomes really joyful being in this playful space. And I think it's finding those people that you can come back to and continue these conversations when you're not in that state. And I wonder, what the experience is with, because interestingly, kind of I guess with the FDA hearing about the MAPS trials, one of the points that I found quite interesting seemed to be that people struggled a bit with integration. And I wonder if that's, because maybe this model doesn't suit something like MDMA. And so then, I've had it as well when I don't know if I've been away and I've been tripping with friends somewhere really beautiful, and then you've got to come back to your everyday kind of normal life, and that can be a bit difficult. But then at least you've got that community of people to kind of say, oh yeah, it is a bit difficult. I don't know, let's create something, let's collaborate, let's do something which makes it more joyful. And possibly if you're one of these people for whom psychedelic therapy is your last resort because you've tried all the other pharmaceutical medications, and then you're coming to this thing in the hope that it's going to cure you, but then you don't actually have that nice, playful, joyful community. And I think that's the thing when you medicalize it and you see it as like it makes it really boring and sterile. So then if you've gone for psychedelic therapy, you're then going to conceptualize that thing as like, oh wow, this is now like, I don't know, an amazing thing which is allowing me to do all these other things, or it's just, okay, thank God something has finally helped my depression. Now I can go back to just doing things that I've been doing anyways, you know. And maybe, yeah, you know, different concepts surrounding mental health, like people such as Johan Hari, that says, well, it's not necessarily an unwell response to have these symptoms in this kind of society. Sort of rambled a little bit there, but
no, yes, it was completely. I think depression is a sane response to the state of the world. Yeah. So I mean, it will be interesting to see how this pans out, particularly as psychedelic therapy becomes mainstream. I caught the opening of the FDA hearing and then got distracted. And what was the result of it? Was it positive?
no, so they've declined approval.
Gosh, wow.
Because well, just the number, it essentially seems to be down to the way in which the trials were conducted rather than the safety of MDMA itself or the efficacy of MDMA.
Is there a chance to revisit this decision anytime
Yeah, I
soon?
think so. It's not a final decision.
Gosh, and everyone thought it was going to go the other way, right? So
yeah,
there must be some investors weeping into their Bitcoin accounts.
yeah, and there's, you know, there's different kind of opinions on this throughout the psychedelic community. You know, speak to someone like Robert Forty, he thinks this is good, and it's held back this tide of, you know, monopolization by the psychotherapeutic paradigm. There's other people who think it's, you know, the FDA are in cahoots with big pharma, and
Right.
it's difficult to pick it apart.
Yeah. We'll see. Yeah.
Mm.
So, how would you like to see psychedelia in 5 years' time or 10 years' time?
I think so. It's kind of difficult in the UK. I feel sometimes a bit jealous of places like the US, where there is the legislation to allow for, whether it's, you know, community elders or people who are facilitating different roles within society that aren't necessarily the psychotherapist or the doctor, or the scientist. You know, it would be nice to, you know, I see a lot of things like psychedelic facilitator training, but this is opened up to people that have already done training in something like psychotherapy, you know. So I would like to see something opened up for artists to be able to, and creative types to be able to facilitate in less of an underground way, I guess, and not have to necessarily do things in line with a certain paradigm, because that certain paradigm doesn't fit everyone. And I think I kind of, I mean, I know I'm biased, but I kind of think the majority of people wouldn't necessarily want a psychedelic experience in a clinician's office. And I don't know how, you know, there's this talk of the need for psychedelic therapists, and I'm, you know, there's a need for more microdosing coaches. There's all this stuff that which is marketed out quite a lot. And I wonder, you know, if people had a taste of something which was more akin to magic and enchantment and this kind of stuff, would that be taken more seriously as, okay, well, actually, you know, the doctors and the scientists can come afterwards, but really we need the magicians and the artists and the herbalists and these types, and the witches, these types of people. And I know that's a biased opinion, but
Yeah, super
and
interesting.
sort of vague, really. But I just think it's, yeah. Can we open up the space for psychedelic training to these types of people?
Well, I think however mainstream it gets, and however much, you know, there will be expensive training courses and certification, and I would imagine astronomic insurance bills. I think there still always will be an underground. There will be the people on the edges, you know, the musicians and the artists, as you say, the magicians and the witches. And it will always be, I think, an interesting sort of tension between those two worlds and the extent to which they influence each other. I mean, we were just chatting before we started recording about integration, and my observation is that what is being offered as psychedelic integration is just hippie stuff that I've seen people offering, you know, workshops at hippie festivals for 20, 30 years. Stuff like guided visualizations and trance dancing and mandala workshops and body work, and you know, this is all just standard fare at your average festival, and yet this is now being packaged up as psychedelic integration. So that this is an area in which the underground is feeding directly into the overground, and it'll be interesting to see how they continue to inform each other, because the underground's not going away.
Yeah. What would you like to see happen in the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
Well, I was worried you were going to ask me that, because I mean, I'm going to be honest, right? That on the one hand, the growing legitimization of psychedelics is wonderful, and you know, it's been a long time coming, but I have gainful employment in this area, for which I'm profoundly grateful. But a part of me can't help think that something has been lost, and I miss the good old days of feeling like I was on the outside and part of a counterculture. I enjoyed the alterity, so it's not a very I'm a little bit embarrassed to make that confession, but you know, if the thing you've always wanted, you suddenly get it, you're a bit like, oh, well, not like that.
I had this thought recently. I was saying to someone, I was like, man, you know, it was quite a lot of fun being on the stall at the Freshers' Fair for the Psychedelic Society in 2010, where I'd get a real rush when people would come up and be like, what do you mean Psychedelic Society? And I'd be like, aha, you know, and it was really cool. And now, you know, Jake with my friend, I was like, God, psychedelics are so lame and boring. It's all just become it's like more, you know, it's more exciting like doing gardening at the moment.
Psychedelic Gardening Society, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I do think that playful quality will always come through, and I think it's very much a strand of British psychedelia. I think it was there in the 60s and 70s, you know, with the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, the whole Canterbury scene.
Yes.
It never took itself too seriously. Lots of wordplay, lots of tomfoolery, and I think that is sort of woven into the core of the DNA of these islands, and I think will probably always be there. I think there'll probably always be people chanting Ken Barlow outside the clinic, you know. Well, I've enjoyed this ramble very much.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Oh, nice one.